Dean Joseph Nye, Collins family, Mr. Richard Fisher, ladies and gentlemen. In February this year, Dean Nye invited me to be the first visiting fellow of the Collins Family International Fellowship, founded in honor of the late Congressman James Collins from Texas. It's a program to highlight the careers of some of the world's most distinguished leaders, so that these leaders may serve as role models for future generations of emerging leaders, students of public policy, scholars, and practitioners. That's in quotes I hesitated to accept, feeling that perhaps it sent it to the wrong person. My work was on a small frame of an island some 224 square miles at low tide, not to be compared with the white canvas of other world leaders. First question I ask in writing this speech: are there lessons on leadership? It's easier to recognize a man who is already a leader than to identify one before he becomes a leader. During my 40 years in office, I've met many foreign leaders in government, in the military, and in business. The characteristics they have in common were self-confidence, breadth of mind, the ability to see the woods for the trees, and the ability to communicate. I'm familiar with most of the first generation of anti-colonial leaders to which I belong. They all had strong nationalist, anti-colonial convictions and wanted to prove that their people or their peoples could measure up to their former rulers. Unhappily, many third world leaders who had successfully demolished the old order failed to build a new one, because building a new order demanded different and more complex capabilities. Decision-making in economics to achieve the highest returns on capital was not their forte. They could enthuse their followers to keep up the fight against the old regime, and they had oversimplified what needed to be done after the colonizers have handed over power. Many leaders actually believed their own rhetoric, that once they were rid of their exploiters, there would be wealth aplenty to go around. And the economic models that they admired were socialists. Why did these leaders follow the wrong model? Were they ignorant? On the contrary, many, like Michael Manley, the late Prime Minister of Jamaica, they were highly intelligent men, and he was a graduate of a distinguished institution, the London School of Economics. But they admired the early independence heroes: Nehru, Sukarno, Mao Zedong, Tito. None of these early freedom fighters believed that wealth was something that had to be created by entrepreneurs, people who raised capital, organized workers to produce goods and services that others wanted and would pay for because their prices were competitive. They all believed that there were shortcuts to prosperity, and they thought the best way was by state intervention. This was a mistake that otherwise well-intentioned leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania made. He was a good, honest Christian, but held doctrinaire ideas on how to modernize Tanzania. His policies were ill-suited for a small-scale African agricultural economy. And both Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia failed to develop their economies. On the other hand, Jomo Kenyatta and his successor, Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya, made their country more prosperous in spite of considerable corruption. What was the difference? It lay in the interventionist state policies of the first two compared to the free market policies of Kenya. I've been asked time and again, how was it that my colleagues and I avoided falling into this trap? Before I answer this question, let me start by explaining how I became politicized. The first turning point of my life was World War II, the way the British was routed by the Japanese. Before the war broke out, our British rulers feared that the Asians would panic if bombs and shells fell upon them. When the bombs and shells actually came, it was the British bosses who were shocked and packed their families off. Their Chinese, Indian, and Malay subjects stoically bore their sufferings. That aura of overwhelming superiority with which the British held us in thrall was broken, never to be restored. Another turning point was the experience of the brutality and cruelty of our Japanese conquerors. They had portrayed themselves as liberators of fellow Asians from the white man, but they left us in no doubt that they were the new masters of the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And to punish the Chinese in Singapore for supporting the nationalist government of China with donations to fight Japanese aggression, within the first 15 days of their conquest of Singapore, they picked off at random 50,000 to 100,000 Chinese youths out of concentration centers and machine gunned them on the beaches. I had first-hand experience of Japanese militarism when a Japanese platoon was decided to build themselves in my home. My family had fled to the countryside, and it was 4 days of hell. I was roughed up, slapped, made to kneel down by a sentry, kicked in the chest, sent sprawling because I did not know that I had to bow to him to cross the bridge. I felt that the dark ages had descended upon us. And I watched 80,000 dejected British, Indian, and Australian troops march into captivity in 48 hours. Many of my friends shared this harrowing experience. We asked ourselves, why? What right had the Japanese to do this to us? Why did the British not fight the Japanese more ferociously to defend us? And when the British came back after 3.5 years, after the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the communists who had organized the resistance in the jungles of Malaya attempted to grab power as theirs as of right. But I feared them as much as I feared the Japanese. As a result, many nationalists like me were born. After the war, my contemporaries and I gathered in London. We were studying in various universities in England, and there was ferment in the air. India had got its independence in 1947. So had Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon. Why not Malaya, which then included Singapore? The British cut off Singapore from Malaya as they prepared to give independence to the Malays in Malaya. They wanted to keep Singapore as one link in a chain of naval bases from Portsmouth to Gibraltar, to Suez, to Aden, to Singapore, to Sydney. But after the British lost Suez in 1956, they agreed to let us rejoin Malaya. By then, it was too late. The Malay majority was not prepared to treat their Chinese, Indian, and other ethnic groups as equal citizens when they became as numerous as the Malays. What were my motivations? First, to get rid of colonialism and be independent. This got us involved in a fight against the communists who were well ahead of us in the struggle against the British. Later, we rejoined Malaya and had to fight the Malay extremists who wanted to dominate other ethnic groups in Malaysia. As a result, in less than 2 years of federation, Singapore was asked to leave. And we had to agree because the alternative was bloodshed, which the Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, warned us. So suddenly, in August 1965, we had to create a nation out of a motley collection of Chinese, Indians, Malays, and others who had come to Singapore to seek a better life, but not to be a nation. How did we escape choosing the wrong model? Well, we were helped by the examples of failed policies in many new countries. India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, and Indonesia had gained their independence in the 1940s. Ghana and Nigeria in the 1950s. By 1965, they were not thriving. India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had imbibed socialist theories from his generation of British philosophers, economists, and political scientists when he was a student at Cambridge. A powerful factor then was the example of the British under Clement Attlee, whose Labour government had set out to equalize opportunities and results. Their policies led to the nationalization of key industries, iron and coal, steel mills, petrochemicals, synthetic fiber plants, all became state enterprises. So did the railways, the buses, and all manner of transportation. For more than 4 decades, India made the same car, a 1950 Morris Oxford, in a state-run factory. They called it the Hindustan. No one checked the bottom line for rates of return on capital. Profit was a dirty word associated with the capitalists. Now let me confess that in my student days up at Cambridge in the 1940s after World War II, I was convinced that Britain's welfare state was the highest form of civilized society. And in my teen years, I was a great admirer of Pandit Nehru. But I could see that he had adopted the wrong model by the 1960s. That he had set India on the path of a planned economy with concentration on heavy industries, and his successors carried on with these policies until Prime Minister Narasimha Rao began to change course late in the mid-1990s. But there was another compelling reason for pragmatic solutions. In 1965, when we became independent, Indonesia under President Sukarno, a great orator, was waging an undeclared war, low intensity, which he called konfrontasi, an Indonesian word for confrontation, against Singapore and Malaysia. And in Malaysia, the Tunku, the Prime Minister, wanted to bypass Singapore as Malaysia's commercial outlet. We could not afford to risk our future on theories. We had a daunting task to create a new economy, not one so dependent on entrepot trade with our neighbors. And independence brought worries for our future, not euphoria. We were no longer the commercial, administrative, or military center of the British Empire in Southeast Asia. The British were departing. The odds were against our survival, and we had to ensure our own existence, which we had previously taken for granted. Our first preoccupation for survival, which meant economic viability, had to be solved. Next, security. I cast around for solutions. We reached out first to Hong Kong and Taiwan investors in textiles, garments, plastics, and low value-added products. Later, a UNDP expert working in Singapore described to me how Israel had leapfrogged its neighbors who boycotted them, and exported to Europe and America fruits, flowers, many other things. I thought to myself, why not seek links with the developed countries? Get industrial investments from Europe, Japan, and America. They came, but far and few between. Then, fortuitously, China went into a convulsion of the Cultural Revolution, and it reached a crescendo in 1967. So computer companies like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, National Semiconductors, they passed over Taiwan and Hong Kong, and we attracted them to Singapore. We had political stability, industrial peace, plus English as our working language, pull factors. 20 years later, we had become a major manufacturer of electronics, computers, and disk drives. The leapfrog strategy succeeded. I worked out another strategy, the other side of the coin. That was to create or to turn Singapore, a third world island, into a first world oasis in a third world region, so that entrepreneurs and their families from the first world would base themselves in Singapore whilst they explored the region. So we established up-to-date facilities in communications and transportation, airport, container port, state-of-the-art telecoms and security, personal and public security, health standards to approximate first world, and a living environment equal to the first world. Later, we improved our cultural facilities, museums, symphony orchestras, visiting artists. The hardware part was easy. Getting people to change their habits to match first world infrastructure that they now had, that was difficult, slow and painful. We made progress by a series of campaigns involving the whole population. More courtesy, stop spitting, keep public lavatories clean, not a minor item if you want a tourist trade to prosper, and no chewing gum if you don't want your train doors not to close, and no litter, and no pickpockets. One rewarding decision was to green up the island with trees, palms, shrubs, creepers, flowers, to make Singapore different. We had rain the year, whole year round, sunshine. All we needed to do was to plant them and trim them. And we involved the whole population in planting and caring for them. And we made progress. And slowly our people are now acting more like a first world civic society, although there's a long way to go. They still have their telephones buzzing in concerts. We had to do a U-turn to carry our people with us, or we would fail. In place of constant strife and agitation, we had to convince workers and their union leaders that unless we had industrial peace and worker cooperation with management to improve productivity, we would be overwhelmed by our unemployment. The history of Singapore after independence was one hard, long slog to make ourselves relevant and useful to the world, to add value to both foreign investments that we sought and those that we ourselves made with our savings. Our next major task was to establish security, which had to be based on social cohesion of our many races, religions, languages, and cultures. All successor governments of colonial regimes have inherited this problem of multi-tribal, multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural solidarity. How to achieve it? Because without a cohesive people at peace with each other, development was not possible. Our solution to the problem of a young nation was a policy of deliberate gradualism in all matters which involved race, language, culture, and religion. We have 77% Chinese, but from different parts of China speaking different and mutually unintelligible dialects. 14% Malay Muslims from different parts of Malaysia and Indonesia. 8% Indians from different parts of India, speaking totally different languages. The rest from Europe and other parts of Asia. We needed a common language. Had we legislated for one, there would have been trouble. Which one? So we encouraged everyone to learn two languages, English and the mother tongue. English is no group's mother tongue, so no one gained any advantage. And we made it our working language. We have not forced or pressure-cooked a national identity. We have refrained from suppressing ethnic cultures, languages, religions, or their sense of separate identity. We aimed for integration, not assimilation. Another critical decision I made within a year of independence was to build a national service armed force. If we did not have the ability to defend ourselves, nobody, not even our own people, would have faith in our future. Foreign and UN intervention would always come too late. So we studied the Swiss, the Swedes, and the Israelis. The Israelis offered help to build a system for a totally national service armed force. We now have a credible defense capability. To produce results, we need a clean government with an effective civil service. And we had to shape the administration to produce that effective instrument of policy. This required strong, fair, and just leaders with a moral strength to command the respect of the people. Unity in the core group of leaders ensured that we sent clear signals to our people and avoided confusion that would have arisen if the team had bickered and split. Leaders must have that sense of being trustees, that they are only temporarily in charge of the destinies of their people, and that their duty is not only to discharge this trust, but also to pass it on to equally trustworthy and competent hands. So luxurious living while our people were left in poverty and backwardness was out. We ensured complete accountability and open separateness between personal assets and public funds. Corruption, which has been a cancer in many societies, had to be eradicated and constantly kept down. A government voted into office needs an efficient, honest administration staffed by officers recruited completely on merit by a politically neutral body. We had an impartial, capable public service commission with a chairman and members who were shrewd at assessing character. Promotions and rewards of scholarships must be made to the best candidates, and they have to share the nation-building philosophy and the development goals of the political leaders. They must also be adequately paid so that temptations would not be too difficult to resist. Once a political system has been corrupted, right from the top, from the very top to the lowest rungs of the bureaucracy, the problem is almost impossible to solve without a revolution. The cleansing and disinfecting has to start from the top and go downwards in a thorough and systematic way. It was a long and laborious process that can be carried out only by a very strong group of leaders with the courage and the moral authority derived from unquestioned integrity. We just managed it and stopped it before it got out of control. Next, we decided that the people should be stakeholders. Soon after separation, I resolved to enable every household to own their own home. If you're going to get a people to take national service seriously, I could not ask other people's sons to fight and die for the properties of the wealthy. So we worked out a personal savings scheme that allowed them to own an apartment painlessly through installments over 20 years. Today, 95% of Singaporean households are homeowners. Their value between 100,000 US to 400,000 US, between a 3-room to a 5-room apartment. Without this home ownership, we would have become like Tokyo, Seoul, or Hong Kong, where the voters in the city are disaffected when they have to pay a large proportion of their salaries in rents. In Singapore, they have voted for the return of the government in 9 successive general elections. They know who will keep the property values of their homes up. Policies must be pragmatic, not dogmatic. I learned early to ignore political correctness and to reject conventional wisdom when it did not accord with reality or my experience. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, it was politically correct to be anti-American and anti-multinationals. The theory expounded by Latin Americans like Raul Prevesh was that multinationals would reduce them to dependencia. We did not accept this. And we assiduously courted the MNCs. They had the capital, the technology, the know-how, and the markets. We decided it was the fastest way of learning on the job, working for them and with them. Now, I believe it will be equally mistaken to follow mindlessly the current politically correct and stridently advocated view that democracy is the precondition for economic development. I know it's a heresy in Harvard, Cambridge. The theory goes that without democracy, Russia could not develop a free market. Russia could not develop a free market with or without democracy. And it was not borne out by the experience of Taiwan, South Korea, or post-open door China. What a country needs for growth and progress is stability and good government, one that is honest and effective and works for the benefit of the people. Good government should never be shackled by theories, however attractive and logically elegant. From the outset, we decided that education was the key to our future. In what language should we teach? This was a sensitive and emotive issue involving the mother tongues and cultures of various races. And I had to resist the pressure to make Chinese the primary language, although 77% of the people were Chinese. Instead, I made English the working language, not the official language, just the working language. Let's be practical. And I allowed parents to choose between schools that taught in English and Chinese, or Malay and Tamil, or in Chinese with English, or Malay in English, and Tamil in English. It was their choice. And in a few years, parents realized that their children's future was best assured when they were competent in English. In other words, English as the first language and the mother tongue as the second language, because even our Chinese banks were switching to English. We expanded schools, built new technical institutes, polytechnics, and universities. This proved decisive for our progress. My final and most important decision was to prepare, or rather to plan and prepare for succession, and not leave it to chance. After 3 successful elections in 10 years, since we first won and took office in '59, my old guard colleagues and I were troubled by the caliber of the young men that we had been able to induct. They were the best of our political activists, our supporters, professionals, academics with PhDs, but they were not equal to the original team. My original team had been thrown up by the upheavals of the Second World War and were among the best of that generation. Those that didn't have it were knocked out by sheer elimination of events. Now we were not getting the best to volunteer to join us. We had to identify potential leaders. But how? Well, some people are natural alphas. Activists in their school days as school prefects, sport captains, or presidents of college societies. Alphas usually are extroverts with high energy levels. But as these school and college leaders grew older, many did not measure up. The valedictorian in school does not always make it after college. Few of those voted in college as most likely to succeed make it in the real world. As they grow older, they need other qualities to stay as leaders: higher levels of intellectual ability, a steady character, judgment, a decision-making capability that can win the confidence of those around them. 7 times from 1959 to 1990, before each election, I had to select 20 to 30 candidates who were likely to make good as ministers, but first as members of parliament, and then some as ministers. The easiest attribute to determine is intelligence. Performance in examinations, IQ tests, SAT scores, they give a fair indication of analytical ability. Many that we fielded with PhDs failed as ministers. They lacked something. When I learned from American corporate leaders that they used psychometric tests to recruit and promote their executives, I recall the epic flight of the 3 astronauts on Apollo 13. If you remember, their spaceship malfunctioned 3,000 miles out in space. Any false move, and they would never return to Earth. They remained calm, collected throughout the ordeal, and trusting their fate to the men at ground control whose instructions they followed meticulously. I concluded that NASA's psychological tests on the ground had successfully eliminated those who were prone to panic in a crisis. I decided in 1980, therefore, to adopt their practice. And I had psychological and psychometric tests to help us assess the character of candidates, to weed out those who were not likely to succeed. But they couldn't help us. They couldn't tell us who was likely to succeed. The prospect of failure forced us to talent spot. After a high attrition rate at the beginning, we improved our selection methods. We threw candidates into the deep end of the pool to test their political skills. Finally, I was concerned that the government machinery of the 31 years had been customized to suit my work style. So I made a conscious effort in my last 2 years to make room for my successor so that he can reconfigure the arrangements. So when a new guard of men in their 40s and 50s took over in 1990, there was no crushing of gears, and instead, in the 1990s, Singapore has repeatedly been rated by Transparency International in Berlin among the top 7 least corrupt countries in the world, the least corrupt in Asia. And we have not become decadent and corrupt after 41 years in office. The old guard set high standards because they were brought up that way. The new guards have been able to maintain this self-discipline and integrity in the midst of growing affluence. Our judiciary and the rule of law are rated by the World Economic Forum and the Institute of Management and Development in Geneva, and PERC, which is a rating agency in Hong Kong, as the best in Asia. It commands the respect of the people and of our investors. And Singapore is ranked by WEF and IMD as the second most competitive nation in the world after the United States. They say I do not listen to my opponents. I do, when they are serious opponents. We studied all those items where we were rated poorly, and we set out to do better. We practiced lifelong learning before it became a buzzword. What were the basic strengths that made this possible? A basic idealism and an integrity that drives the whole system. But new forces are at work. The present leaders grew up in a Singapore that was stable and growing year by year. People have got accustomed to the comforts of a modern, affluent society and expect life to be better every year. Opinion polls are becoming a regular feature of public life. Leadership has been reduced to the shaping of a policy so that somehow it would be able to carry the majority. And if not the majority, then the plurality, in the hope that it will expand into a majority by the next election. I view this with mixed feelings as a totally different way from what I used to do. In the 1960s, strikes, demonstrations, disorder, and violence threatened our existence. People faced dire choices. Leaders had to lead. make bold decisions, and act swiftly. Only later did I have to convince the people to support our decisions. For example, I had to carry out a campaign to win a referendum to take Singapore into Malaysia. But when bloodshed threatened and the Malaysian government wanted Singapore to be out, I did not. Indeed, I could not hold a referendum and consult the people before I took them out. That would have meant disaster. I took the decision, persuaded my cabinet colleagues to sign the separation agreement with me, and embarked on independent Singapore. To build a more stable Singapore, I did not discuss nor ask our different races whether they liked to live integrated together in new high-rises when we were building to replace the squatter huts. I knew what the answer was going to be. They wanted to stay together. But would that be good for us? The British had allowed them to be segregated in Malay villages, Chinese quarters, and an Indian enclave because it was easier to rule such groups of people separated by race, language, and religion. We had to form a nation, or try to. So my colleagues and I decided that the people would ballot for their apartments. And they would have Chinese, Malays, Indians, Eurasians, and others as their neighbors. We did not seek their consent. For the first few years, they were not comfortable. After 10 years, it became a way of life. We did the same in the schools. Children used to be segregated into Malay, Chinese, Indian, and English language schools. Slowly and gradually, I persuaded parents to register their children for schools that use English and the mother tongue as a second language. And when they did so, their children graduated into the best jobs. Now we have schools with all races in mixed classrooms, and integration has become a fact of life. The business of government can be executed effectively only by people's representatives, exercising their judgments based on their mandate. The people had given me a mandate to join Malaysia on fair terms. When the Prime Minister of Malaysia was fearful of a bloodbath, I exercised my judgment to separate without consulting the people. So also racial integration in housing and schooling was part of my mandate given in elections every 5 years that I won. The difference between the old guard and the new guard leaders are stark, reflecting the differences between the old society and the new. The old society was a revolutionary situation. People felt that everything, including their lives, were at stake. They trusted their leaders and gave us unstinting support. It was an inspired generation that fought against great odds to succeed as an independent country. The new society is secure, comfortable, confident. Many of the young believe that prosperity and stability to be theirs as of right, and to consult them, and that they must be consulted before any change is made which could affect them. Well, this change is unavoidable, but does it mean that leaders have to govern by the polls, as in many developed societies? However, recent upheavals in Indonesia have brutally reminded Singaporeans of the volatility of their surroundings and alerted them to the dangers that lurk around them. This may stop Singaporeans from becoming too complacent and consumer-driven a society, and remind them that they need to make that extra effort to achieve more than the ordinary. Many failures in the Third World were the result of the leaders of the immediate post-independence period, the 1960s to the 80s, abiding by the theory then prevailing that socialism and state enterprises would hasten development. Their interventionist economic policies led to a misallocation of resources and increased opportunities for corruption. That theory was demolished as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is no reason why third world leaders cannot succeed in achieving growth and development if they can maintain social order, educate their people, maintain peace with their neighbors, and gain the confidence of investors by upholding the rule of law. Finally, are great leaders born, or are they the result of revolutionary situations? From my experience, I think it's both, but more because of circumstances. Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping were thrown out of a massive convulsion of 400 to 500 million Chinese after 100 years of decay and decline into warlordism and Japanese occupation. Mao was the revolutionary who liberated China. Deng was the builder who saved China from imploding like the Soviet Union. Who was the greater leader, Mao or Deng? As leader of the Chinese Communist Party in its fight to liberate China, Mao was unquestionably the unbeatable leader, a genius at guerrilla warfare who defeated the Japanese, or helped to defeat the Japanese and the nationalist government. But was he the modernizer of China? Had he lived on, or had Hua Guofeng, his immediate successor, stayed in charge, China would have gone like the Soviet Union. The party heavyweights brought back Deng, a veteran of the Long March, and Deng was not an ideologue like Mao. Ever the realist with a keen sense of the basics of the economy, he realized that the communist system was not delivering. He opened up China economically in 1979 or late 78, kept a tight hold on political and social control of the country. Although the opening up faltered after Tiananmen in 1989, he pushed it again in 1992 while on a southern tour of Guangdong province. Had Deng followed Gorbachev in implementing both glasnost and perestroika at the same time, China would have collapsed in chaos. Are there no great leaders of that caliber in China today? Surely there must be. But present-day China requires a different kind of leader, not creators of liberation armies, but competent, imaginative, builders of the economy and flexible managers of the huge social and political changes that will flow from the opening up of China to the world. The needs of a country vary from time to time. China now has the prospect of becoming an advanced technological society in the next 50 years, provided its leaders can manage the changes to its economy and its society. More important, they have to be courageous and skillful enough to adjust and change their political system to involve their better educated, more articulate, and assertive people, 70% of whom will live in the cities, and they will have to do all this without losing political stability. Similarly, the difference in mood between America and Europe, both under threat in World War II and their comfortable consumer societies of the 1990s. This explains the absence of towering leaders. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Charles de Gaulle, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dean Acheson. They were strong leaders that people needed in times of crisis. Neville Chamberlain gave way to Churchill, who promised the British people blood, sweat, and tears. After Nazi Germany was defeated and the danger had passed, They voted in Clement Attlee as Prime Minister, Churchill's small, mild-looking deputy during the war. Similarly, de Gaulle became the symbol of French resistance to a German-occupied Vichy France under Marshal Pétain. He returned in triumph to Paris in 1944, but went into retirement after he made two partially successful attempts, or unsuccessful attempts, to reorganize the government. He was recalled from retirement and elected president in 1958 by the National Assembly during a severe crisis over the stalemate of the Algerian War. When France was restored to prosperity, the young wanted change and took to the streets. De Gaulle resigned when he lost the referendum in 1969. Security, prosperity, and the consumer society plus mass communications have made for a different kind of person getting elected as leader. One who can present himself and his program in a polished way. Satellite television has allowed me to follow the American presidential campaign. I'm amazed at the way media professionals can give a candidate a new image and transform him, at least superficially, into a different personality. Winning an election becomes, in large measure, a contest in packaging and advertising. These new techniques have been so successful that Europe has also bought into them. A spin doctor now is a high-income professional, one in great demand. From such a process, I doubt if a Churchill, a Roosevelt, or a de Gaulle can emerge. The difference between Winston Churchill and Tony Blair is the difference between their two societies. One caught in a titanic struggle, the other comfortable and secure, facing no external threats, reluctant to join Europe, or reluctant to join the euro, or to have his accustomed way of life upset in a federal Europe. Revolutionary situations throw up great leaders who demand blood, sweat, and tears. Comfortable circumstances produce leaders who promise people an even easier life, whether they can deliver it or not. But when the British felt that Britain was slipping, they voted for a conviction politician in Margaret Thatcher 3 times, from 1979 to 1990. Similarly, when the Americans feared that their country was becoming weak during the Carter years, when American diplomats were held as hostages in Tehran and the Soviet Union menacingly invaded Afghanistan, they voted for Ronald Reagan for 2 terms. Germany, defeated and divided after the war, produced Konrad Adenauer. Germany recovered and became the economic engine of Europe. Germans still felt threatened and vulnerable. They voted 4 times for another conviction politician, Helmut Kohl, who for 16 years cooperated closely with America and established strong bonds with France. When the opportunity came with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, he seized the moment, and by 1990 had reunified Germany. With Germany reunited and the danger from Russia diminished, the people's mood changed. In 1998, they voted Kohl out in favor of Gerhard Schröder. Germans wanted a change to a new media-savvy generation of Bill Clintons and Tony Blair. This brings me to my last question. Can you teach a person to be a leader? Yes, if that person has the primary attributes to be a leader. Then lessons in leadership will help him develop his skills and become more effective, a leader with fewer costly errors. Arnold Toynbee, in his massive study of history, argues that if the challenge is too great for a people, they will fail, however great the leader. But that if there is no challenge, our people will not achieve much. Fortunately for Singapore, the challenge was not beyond the capability of its leaders to draw the best out of the people. If Singapore has once again to face circumstances as daunting as those in the first decade of its existence, both people and leaders must be able to rise to the occasion for the country to survive. Thank you. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. There are 4 microphones, 2 on the floor here and 2 in the balcony. And I would like people to identify themselves before they ask their question and where they are at Harvard. And also, I'd like to remind you that questions are brief and end with a question mark. We've had the one speech we'll have this evening, and they also come 1 per customer. So let me turn here.
Good evening, Senior Minister Lee. My name is Felicity Spector, and I work at the Centre for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School. I'm also a television journalist from Britain, and it's in that aspect, if you like, that I ask my question. When you were an opposition member of the Malay Parliament in 1964, you passionately defended the idea of a free press, and you said, if your ideas and your views cannot stand the challenge of criticism, then they are too fragile and not sturdy enough to last. Why then, as the leader of Singapore, did you react to restrict the freedom of the press and of opponents within Parliament? And do you think this has stopped Singapore from becoming a first world civic society in the fullest sense of the meaning?
Circumstances change and create new situations, and the individual must react to it. Rhetoric is part of the business of leadership. It is. But even as I said it in Malaysia, I knew that certain things were out of bounds. In Singapore, when we had just separated and the Malays were unhappy, they felt betrayed and abandoned, for issues of race, language, and religion to be raised in public would have been very dangerous. Therefore, I think there's something wrong with you.
See. You got the mic? His mic is going to. Use mine.
It should be on? Okay, fine. I do not believe that we had suppressed or stifled the opposition. An open debate is necessary for any democracy, but there are certain areas which at various times in the people's history are too sensitive for open discussion. Let me explain. If in the 1960s I had raised the question of whether Chinese should or should not be the national language, I might have ended up in a riot. So I quietly called up the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and told them that if they wanted peace and quiet, they should not be pressing for Chinese as the national language, because that will immediately stir up such a hornet's nest, fear in the Malays and the Indians who wouldn't be able to master the language and would be at each other's throats. Now, in the more relaxed circumstances of the 1990s or the year 2000, anybody can say what they like about language because the issue is quite clear. Parents have decided that that is the way to the future. But even today, if you have a free-for-all for religion, we're going to end up in a real mess. I brought a case against the Far Eastern Economic Review in 1989, where they had accused me of attacking the Catholic Church, which was completely unfounded. So a very aggressive British QC gave me 2 days in the witness box to say, what's wrong? I said to him that he could defend Salman Rushdie's book in England, but that we had already decided to ban it before it became an issue. Was it wise? I think it was. What was the point of having this unnecessary rumpus? Freedom of intellectual discussion, when it was a matter that aroused enormous passion. The Muslims in Singapore were not interested in what was in Salman Rushdie's book. They were interested in the fatwa or the edict of the Iranian Ayatollah, and that anybody who killed Salman Rushdie would get a reward and go to heaven. So in that situation, you begin to argue. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, I think much of the trouble really is that some things are not possible of civil discourse. It arouses too much passion and emotion. But as we become more affluent and comfortable and our Malays are more relaxed, perhaps we can do this. But then we have neighbors who are quite easily agitated by what we are saying in Singapore. So we have to be careful. We are not Britain with the French to worry about or the Germans. We have a different backdrop, and we have to have a keen sense of survival.
My name is Tuxuan Wang. I'm the current Kennedy School student. My question is about the mainland China and Taiwan relationship, the so-called cross-strait relationship. I know you have a very good relationship with both leaders in Beijing and leaders in Taiwan. You recently visited Taiwan and met the newly elected President Chen Shui-bian. So my question is, how do you envision the cross-strait relationship, and how all the parties, including the mainland China, Taiwan, U.S., and Japan, should take action to peacefully solve the problem. I also know both President Jiang Zemin and President Chen Shui-bian respect you very much. So you met them regularly.
What? Back me very much.
No, I mean, respect you.
Respect.
Yeah. Sorry, respect you very much. So in that sense, how do you define your role in solving the cross-strait relationship the problem?
Are you from Taiwan or the mainland?
I'm from Beijing.
From?
I'm from Beijing.
You're from Beijing. Well, I am on record as saying that this is a very difficult issue, one which could easily lead to an unfortunate conflict. I have watched with growing concern the exchanges across the straits, and I think at some time a decision has to be reached on the formula that will restart talks and reduce tensions. That formula, that Beijing has clearly defined as the One China principle. Taiwan believes that if it agrees to the One China principle, then it's already in the box, that it can't go anywhere else but One China. My best interlocutor was Professor Li Yuanze, the Nobel Prize winner, the Taiwanese Nobel Prize winner, who's now collecting a cross-party consensus. He said, and I think he's right if you go by the voting figures, that 70% of the people in Taiwan do not want immediate reunification. At the same time, 70% of the people of Taiwan also do not want independence because they would have grave consequences. So what they would like is the status quo. I asked him, how long could the status quo last if during the status quo, in the last 12 years, former President Lee Teng-hui moved from the One China to each his own explanation into the two-state theory, and that if that went on to another 4 years, it is not unlikely that the mainland would do something. So he said, and I repeated what he said to make sure that it's public knowledge, that the One China issue cannot be avoided. 不可破壁的, he said. And that One China can be the umbrella that will enable the status quo to remain non-confrontational. So I'm waiting for him to collect his consensus, and maybe some action will be taken. But if not, then I am not optimistic about the outcome. I left slightly less pessimistic because I concluded that President Chen Shui-bian was a different personality and character from President Lee Teng-hui. President Lee Teng-hui is an ideologue. He believes he has a mission, that he is Moses and has the promised land that he must lead the Taiwanese people to. President Chen Shui-bian has just won an election by a minority. He has a big problem of getting his policies through because the legislative yuan is controlled by other parties, and the elections next year is not likely to change that. So he is preoccupied with political survival and not with dramatic, earth-shaking moves that will convert Taiwan into something different. So I think that is room for less pessimism. So I hope the mainland will be patient, and maybe they will come to the same conclusion as I have, that perhaps he will look for a way out to save his position with his party, because the other two parties, the KMT and the People's First Party of James Song, that's about 60+% of the votes, they are for going back to the 1992 consensus. So there is already a majority for going back to that consensus.
Thank you.
We have the next question on the left side of the balcony.
Good evening. My name is Hector Bladwell, and I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. To me, one of the most interesting things of your speech was the fact that you mentioned that for development to occur, you had to change some of the habits, the cultural traits, the everyday things that people did in Singapore, and kind of like make it more seem like Western societies, although not assimilate. And this has been promoted in many Latin American countries where there are kind of democratic societies, and there has been opposition to this. and it has not been implemented because of that. It has also been promoted in the Middle East. So I'm wondering, what is it about the society in Singapore that facilitated the incorporation of the values that you were promoting? Was there something inherent to society in Singapore that facilitated this as opposed to in other countries?
Are you Latin American?
Yes, I'm from Puerto Rico.
But that's not Latin America. No,
Culturally, it is.
okay, I accept your definition of yourself. I don't think I've made myself clear. We did not change the cultural habits, the cultural beliefs or value systems of the people. What we did was to change their overt behavior. When we had people living in shanty huts made of soap boxes and zinc roofs with a hole in the ground for a water closet and no running water or electricity, life is somewhat rough and ready. Now, when you put them into high rises with lifts and running hot and cold and power, all the other amenities of life, you cannot behave the way you did when you lived in a shanty hut. I give you a simple illustration. I discussed it this morning, but I think I might as well tell you. You might find this difficult to believe, but having moved in there, they know they got a water closet, but they like to be a source of annoyance to their neighbors. So they will urinate in the lifts so that everybody would be inconvenienced. So to overcome this, our housing authority devised a special mechanism that would make the lift stop. And you will be apprehended. To defeat that, they press the button, they stand outside and pee into it. To defeat that, we installed a camera. So it's like mine warfare, submarine, mine, anti-mine. It goes to show just how tenacious people are in making a nuisance of themselves to other people. Why they get satisfaction out of this, I will never understand. But some things are more dangerous. When they don't want an old piece of furniture and it's too big to go into the lift, they just go to the veranda and toss it out. And people have been killed on the pavement below. So we now have a law which says if you do that, it's a crime, and you will go to jail, and you will lose your flat. And the next time you get housing, you'll be on the ground floor. So you see how difficult it is to change people's habits. But nevertheless, we have made them stop spitting. Spitting is a great Chinese tradition. From time immemorial. And if you go to China, if I were in Shenzhen or in Hong Kong, I wouldn't try this campaign. They'll just turn around and tell me, our great-grandfathers did this, don't tell me to do different. But in Singapore, having transplanted ourselves, we then explain to them, not only is it disgusting, it will spread tuberculosis and so many other things. And we educated the boys and girls in school, had it on television. Then when we had confined it to a minority who hawk and spit into the street, then we fined them and punish them. And I'm proud to say that when Deng Xiaoping came to visit Singapore in 1978, he was amazed that there was no spitting. So I had provided for him a Ming white and blue spittoon. I absolutely did, because when I went to the Great Hall of the People, they had these spittoons. And it's a great Chinese culture to do this. But when he found that nobody else in Singapore did this, he did not make use of it. The next time I went to the Great Hall of the People, the spittoons had disappeared. So you see, change can come about. It takes time.
Other side of the balcony.
Me?
Yeah.
I don't really have a question, but since you've asked me, I will go ahead.
No. No. Then,
That's okay. That's okay.
We're just doing questions.
Good evening, Premier Yu. Question. I'm Indian by origin, and you've done a remarkable job in Singapore in a few decades. How do you think India can improve in similar ways? Are you familiar, and how do you think the same things can happen within that country?
India has been a country that has enormous potential, and for the last 5 decades have missed many opportunities to achieve its potential. With the IT, it's beginning to emerge as a great player in the IT software business. I'm told it's because there's no ministry to regulate it. So I was interested to watch your new minister for IT being questioned. I can't remember whether it was CNBC or CNN or whatever. But he vehemently, and he was a very able debater, he vehemently asserted that his job was to help the IT industry, not to cripple it. That because IT required 24 hours power, he will ensure that there's enough power throughout India, that power and telephones will be spread all over India so that full advantage can be taken of IT. Well, if he can do that and get his other ministers to do that and change the way the bureaucracy works, India will achieve its potential. I have some reservation because I've had several disappointments. For example, when your last or former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao met my Prime Minister a few years ago and said, you have 7 million foreign tourists come visit you. Why not bring them to India? He said, yes, delighted. So we put up a plan, beautiful sketch plans of hotels that we will build, tour coaches that we will bring, but we needed an airline with landing rights. And he agreed that Singapore Airlines will form a joint venture with Tata and compete against Air India. And all these tourist destinations will be direct flights from Singapore. The Minister for Civil Aviation says, no, this is a family heirloom. Prime Minister was overruled. The plan is gathering dust for the last 5 years. Now a new plan is out to sell Air India up to 40%. So Singapore Airlines is in discussions with Tata to buy 40%. I am tempted, it's not my business, but I was thinking of dropping a little note to the chairman of Singapore Airlines to say, does 40% give us management control? We're putting in, let's say, 20% of that 40%, and will be run around by Air India management and Air India unions. Where does it go? So why not start a new airline? But then you'll be back to the same old story. So I don't know what's going to happen. We try.
This will have to be the last question since we've now run out of our time.
Good evening. My name is Pratana Phongpivat. I'm
From?
from Thailand,
Yeah.
currently a PhD student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I was impressed by
Fletcher
your
School. You're
Yeah.
not in Harvard.
They take courses here. We're very closely related.
Well, I did. I was impressed by your speech that how much you have shaped Singapore to be one of the leading world countries. And while you, however, did not really touch upon some problems in Singapore. And my question is, how would you address some problems like the underpopulation and the lack of working class? Or how do you concern about the encouragement of the government to try to encourage more birth rate and the unbalance of ratio that you try to keep?
I didn't catch the last few.
Unbalance of the racial rate.
The racial imbalance that,
Yeah.
that is going to arise from the encouragement of government to try to increase birth rate in some of the area or some of the race.
This is a very serious problem. I'm not sure that the incentives are going to work. Our birth rates, fertility rates have gone down from the 1970s, where we were about 2.8, 2.9 average per woman. Now it's about 1.5. And for the educated woman, it's 1.4. For the uneducated, it's about 1.6, 1.7. The Malays are just replacing themselves, 2.1, 2.2. The Indians are not replacing themselves. They are also around 1.8, 1.9. So all these concessions will produce a minor spurt, and then it'll tail off. We did that the last time in 1985. It moved upwards and it tailed off. The problem is a very difficult one to solve. It's got to do with changing lifestyles and changing values and a self-centered way of life. Why do I want children? It hampers my career development. I want to see the world. I want both incomes to enable us to fulfill our lives. And what's the profit in 2 children? Well, 1 may be good enough, and we can concentrate everything on 1. They're also marrying later, having trouble having children, and I'm not sure we can reverse it because it's a worldwide trend. The French have been partially successful. It's got nothing to do with the racial imbalance. The Muslims are slightly above average, 2.2, 2.3, but they're not multiplying by all that number because they are also trapped in this desire for higher quality of life, travel, more of the comforts of wealth and the consumer society. Fortunately, we are a small population, so we are selectively encouraging immigration from other parts of the world, and not just from Asia. We recruit actively from all the universities in the world. Those who've come are mostly from Asia, but there are many who are from Europe, and they have also come to do work here. Of our population of 4 million, 3 million are Singaporeans, 1 million are foreigners. You might find this difficult to believe, but we have an economy that requires workers. 1 million are foreigners. Of them, about 800 to 900,000. 800,000 are unskilled and semi-skilled. 100,000 are in the white-collar class, and 100,000 are managers and professionals and top executives. Of course, like all countries, we hope to draw in from the upper brackets. Because if we allow those from the lower brackets to come in, we have 1 billion Indians and 1.3 billion Chinese. So 4 million Singaporeans will be swamped. So we have to be a little careful. We have created this oasis, and oasis can be stifled. So let's make sure that the spring water is flowing, grass remains green, and don't have too many goats eating up the grass.
Well,
May I try to persuade the senior minister to take a question?
I'm sorry, we are now a good 10 minutes after our time, so we cannot take more questions. But I do hope you will join me in thanking Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew for his fine performance here tonight. That was very good. We should move you out here over the crowd.